We're talking this afternoon with Samina Rahman, who's is perhaps one of my oldest friends, but apart from that, has been very active in several movements along the years. Primarily in the last 11 or 12 years in the women's movement. She's one of the founder members of Women's Action Forum Lahore, is also one of the directors of the Lahore Grammar School, which is a school for girls, and is presently running their college as principal. She's also active, as I said, in several other movements and struggles and organizations. Thank you, Veena, for being with us today. Veena, we're really, as you know, trying to establish or try to understand the dimensions of women and relationship to religion in this context in Islam, with Islam. We're starting actually with each person telling us a bit about their background and to locate whatever that relationship or dimension is within the context of the person's life. So where were you born and your family and what type of upbringing, what was the atmosphere around you?
I was born in Aligarh in India, but my family moved, or rather my mother and my brother and I moved just before partition to Pakistan and came and settled in Lahore. My father joined us a year later, or about a year later. Aligarh in that sense has been very much a part of our consciousness because both my grandparents taught there, lived there. My father taught in the university. And maybe that was what influenced them, or maybe it was that they were a liberal family to begin with, I don't know. But I would say that I got a very liberal education in terms of attitudes towards religion. My mother was perhaps the most orthodox member of the family, and she was a practicing Muslim. My father was, I guess, a believer. He liked to call himself a believer, but I never saw him really practicing religion.
But were you and your brother meant to practice?
I think my mother certainly, we were taught the Quran. I was. My brother claims that he never completed it, but I completed the Quran. I was taught the namaz at an early age, and I would say, yes, I had a fairly orthodox upbringing. But even my mother, who, as I say, was a practicing Muslim, never insisted upon too many rituals. She liked us to believe, but, she never insisted that we said our prayers until I was much older.
But believe in what? In a God? Or
in a God.
All the stories and heaven and hell? And
no. I never got much of that. But there was an emphasis on some religious stories and on the kinder aspects of the religion. She liked us to think that God was love, and she liked us to think that the Prophet was, interested in children, and she'd relate these little stories. But no, I don't think that religion was ever a very big issue in our lives, but it was present. And it was always a source of comfort to me. I remember feeling very comforted by the fact that my mother said her prayers. I somehow thought that absolved me of all responsibility towards God because she was taking care of it. Someone in the home was taking care of me. And I must admit that this was a feeling that continued with me till the day she died. I somehow thought that if I spoke to her about something and I knew she would pray, or she would add it in her prayers at night, I thought I would be taken care of. And this was particularly strong in the days when I was, an adolescent, 12, 13, 14, probably.
You didn't pray yourself for exams in the past?
No, I did. I must admit that I did go through the usual, but please. But it was, it was that please kind of a thing. It wasn't very long or thought out or any kind of structured prayer. But my mother's belief was what sort of held the household together in terms of belief in an orthodox kind of a religion, the closest that we had to orthodoxy. But my father, the whole paraphernalia of religion in its more cultural aspects, I think, came from my father. Because there was a ritual even in his life, and that largely centered around Muharram, surprisingly, although my father was not a Shia, he was a Sunni. But the 10 days of Muharram were devoted to Marsias being read out to us. And I remember very clearly, by my father, this was a family ritual. That
the Marsias are really poetry.
Yes, it was poetry. It was poetry, but it was in Muharram that the whole episode was narrated. I mean, there was poetry in our lives otherwise too. He loved to read to us.
I remember exact moments of poetry on television, with Abba.
That's right. So, this was very important to him. In fact, the Eid and the Bakra Eid and all of that, there was never much of a ritual as far as he was concerned. He would go and say his Eid namaz, which is the only namaz he ever said. I don't believe I never saw him pray otherwise. But, for example, Muharram and the ritual of Muharram, and then, he would talk a great deal about Hazrat Ali, not only about Imam Hassan and Hussein. And then the whole story of Karbala ritualistically each year, and we would sit with him, the entire family, and the Mir and Niece and the Veer would come out and it would be read out to us. And, as he progressed in years, in fact, he would become short of breath. But still, almost till the year my mother died.
From a religious point of view, or was it from Ali when you particularly mentioned there's the whole struggle in Islam and struggle against the state? Was that an aspect that was...
Yes, I think that was the aspect. That, he would always pick up on the political aspect, or he would pick up on the knowledge of Ali. He said that my grandfather, his father, revered Ali a great deal because of his knowledge, because of his scholarship. So it was in that context, but certainly there was a religious context to our lives, in the sense that, these were issues which were debated or which were discussed. Religion was discussed in the home. My father never he permitted a totally open discussion, but he never liked us to be irreverent. And of course, my mother would never have permitted it. So there was no question of that, and he deferred to her in that too. So everything could be said.
But irreverent could be what? Throwing the Quran on the floor? Or
No.
Questioning the Quran?
I think that questioning the Quran even was permitted, but not questioning to say it's rubbish. Or dismissing religion outright. That was not I did not grow up in an atheistic atmosphere. It was not even agnostic.
It was definitely Islamic though, or religious.
It was not religious. It was yes. I think there was an element of spirituality, but it was sort of more like, your roots are in a particular tradition, and that tradition, a part of that tradition is your religion. It was
and that tradition was Islam.
And that tradition was Islam. It was a Muslim tradition. It was Muslim scholarship. It was a Muslim tradition, and that was very much there.
Did you talk at all, because your parents are Muslims, like all our parents grew up with Hindus and Christians and Sikhs and whatever, and there are various trends in that. Some are very antagonistic, who have certain memories, and Hindu is almost a derogatory word in some households. And in your own, what was the relationship?
No. There was never any question of that. In that sense, I guess they accepted all kinds of faiths and beliefs. Even my mother, would occasionally joke and not only say कि मैं आधी Shia हूँ, but she'd also say that maybe I should have been born a Christian. At which point Seema's father said, well, we wouldn't have named you Gulshan, we would have called you Gladys. So it was a family joke. Not only that, all my mother's sisters and my mother had one Hindu name and one Muslim name, which my grandfather insisted upon.
Your nana?
My nana. Who was again a very religious man. Because of the cultural affiliation, because of the closeness to Hindus, because they had so many friends who were Hindus. And, families living next to each other and visiting each other daily and all of that. And I forget what my mother's name was, but I know distinctly, I remember that, she told me that she had a Hindu name as well as a Muslim name. So there was an acceptance of religion, and, there are many photographs in the family album of them celebrating Basant and Holi and water being thrown on them, and all that was very much a part of my upbringing as well, except that, of course, by the time they moved here, there were no Hindus to mix with, or Sikhs, or any other community except Muslims. So I guess we didn't see that much
But you
of
didn't
it.
continue with holy, etc. Because in my childhood, until I was about 12, my mother continued with Hindu tradition.
No, I don't think that there was any of that except Basant.
Basant is still
Which of course is still there. But no, I don't have any memory of that. But I certainly remember enough stories about friends who were close and, relationships and discussion of religion with my grandfather who was a philosopher and particularly, my Nana, particularly interested in comparative religions and things.
And your own relationship to religion at this time, other than the fact that your mother was praying and that gave you support, did you, and praying for exams, did you have any curiosity about it or about God? Or?
In a sense, I was an only child because my brother was so much older than I and he'd left home. And I didn't get to go to school, as I said. So I was by myself and I had this relationship, this particularly close relationship to God. And, I wasn't sure, what he was or what it was, but it was someone I could talk to.
Was he a he? Was it
I
male?
don't think I ever. I can't remember really whether I thought. I think it must have been a he. It must have been a he.
Something out there more powerful than you.
Yes, yes.
Who would have the answers?
Who would have the answers? Except that in my childhood I discovered that he didn't have the answers. And that it was a question of keeping up a dialogue. He seemed to listen quite sympathetically, but never came up with anything that was particularly helpful or relevant at that moment. So the omnipotence of God is not something that I associate my childhood with. In fact, it is when I'm growing up and a little later in my life that I decide to make him omnipotent to serve my needs. But I had a closer, more intimate relationship with God as a child. It became more distant as I grew older. Then I moved into the world and, I went to school and college and had friends. And then, it was the hurried sort of, before going to sleep at night, please make sure that I pass my exam tomorrow, that kind of thing. But at childhood,
and this continues through school and college, this particular...
Yes, I think that my relationship was, continued, got more distant. But by then, as a child, I wasn't such a conventional child because I was pretty much on my own. But as I went to school and college, my responses did become more conventional. And I did want to be like the peer group, and I didn't want to say my namaz and, rosas and fasting and all of it, because everyone around was doing it. Although my mother never insisted on it, surprisingly, when I was in school. It was only in college, when I had abandoned it, that she...
But your mother had this thing about food and
yes,
health
and that's right,
nutrition.
health and food. So, she never pressed. In fact, I pressed. And I insisted, and I would fast, and I would say my prayers. Prayers, yes. She would say, yes, that's okay. But never made a big issue of it.
And finishing college, you went on to government college. That's about the time when I think many of us start really examining the whole issue. Did you at that point continue with this friendship?
By the time I went to government college, I had become very involved in Milton for some reason. Probably because I was studying English literature. And I had got into this whole business of Dante and Milton and, paradise and purgatory and inferno and, found Satan infinitely more interesting than God. As Lucifer. And so this whole thing became very literary at that point. But in a sense, it strengthened my faith. It made it more interesting. I mean, there were dimensions that were added to it. And I remember talking a great deal to my father about it and reading a little bit of Iqbal at that point to see what the influence was of Milton on him and the Shikwa and the Jawab-e-Shikwa and all of that. And but no, I think that's the only point in my life when I've been interested in Christianity and I've followed the career of, say, Donne, who was one of my favorite poets at that point. And I've looked into the sonnets of Hopkins. So that was in fact a literary Christian phase.
But you saw Christian and Islamic and pretty much the same
Yes, yes, I saw them in the same tradition, but took more interest in the Christian tradition and understanding the Christian tradition at that time. I had not had a convent upbringing. So unlike you, I hadn't been through this whole ritual of what Mass is and, Christmas celebrations or whatever the daily prayers were. I had not been exposed to that. I think it is at this point that, I'm more interested in the liturgy and I'm more interested in finding out the whole paraphernalia and the panoply of Christianity and all of that. And I listened to a lot of music at that time and the requiems. And I think that was a very Christian phase of my life, if anything. After that, I lost interest in Christianity completely. In fact, by the time I went to university abroad, it palled. In any case, I was off religion, on to something else altogether.
Religion or God?
Actually, I stopped thinking about God.
You stopped appealing to him.
I
But you never
stopped
consciously
appealing to him.
did not believe in God.
No, I did not.
You just didn't think about
Yes, he just didn't figure in those years at all in my life because I was on to something else altogether.
That's something else being left on.
That's something else being left politics and left philosophy and Marxism and its variants. And so God
Did you see
didn't.
it as the opium of the masses?
Yes, I definitely saw it as the opium of the masses. There are no two ways about it. But somehow I didn't think that I needed to stop believing in God, to start thinking that religion was the opium of the masses. I went along with that. But I don't think I ever rejected God in all
Did you
of
think
this.
God was created by
No. In fact, when one looked at Hegel and Marx and the theses of Feuerbach and all of that, I never dismissed God altogether. It was an interesting proposition intellectually, but emotionally, I wasn't sure that I stood with Marx on that one altogether.
So you then came back to Pakistan from university abroad, and of course, like all of us, came back into the context around one. And you continued, as I know, for some time, still within the Marxist or using a Marxist analysis, or whether one is active or not, another matter. What was your relationship at that point? Did this continue, this type of
Irrelevance.
Irrelevance?
Yes, I think it continued. I came back to Pakistan and got married almost immediately and went into teaching and, as you say, very much within, the political framework or the Marxist framework. And my early years at university were reasonably active as well. So that context continued, but very slowly. It was not so much what was happening around me in the abstract sense, which turned me towards religion again. I think it was a more personal need within me that made me turn towards religion. And in fact, this was a time, I guess, when I was spending more time with my mother as well. And I felt a need for faith. But of course, I rebelled against the normal trappings of faith. And so it was a very personal thing. And again, I needed to fill some kind of emotional vacuum within myself, answer some questions, because very slowly I found myself drifting away from the kind of politics that had absorbed me at university because of the circumstances of life around me, perhaps. And I found that my emotional needs were not being fulfilled.
Well, specifically, I mean, these, for instance, that's the part of the life that I not only remember, but you shared. I'm going to now ask a couple of areas or questions that are personal. One, when you say that your life around you, really we're talking about a middle class, upper middle class life, which didn't quite synchronize or whatever with what one was thinking, and many of us were very troubled by not dashing off into the mountain and taking an MTG or whatever we had thought we were going to do by declassing ourselves. I just wondered whether that played a certain role. The other area, when you say that there was an emotional void, um, what is it that you're talking about?
I think it is, I think this whole business of very rigid Marxism had begun to hit me at that time. I found that intellectually one was able to be excited by it. That really, at a personal level, a lot of relationships were breaking down at that time between people who had worked together and people who had dreamt together and people who had some kind of, dreamt of some kind of a future for themselves. And we were drifting apart. And in a sense, everybody was, we were living in little pockets now, completely cut off from each other. I was at least feeling this a great deal. And so that sustenance which was there, that had slowly been withdrawn. And this tremendous loneliness within, because as you say, one didn't really fit in. One came from a particular class background, but one had moved far enough from it in the years at university to not feel comfortable with it. And, one was back among relatives and friends and people whom one loved, but who didn't think like one. And there was absolutely no reason for them to do so, and one continued to care for them in any case. So the dilemma was there. I somehow felt that in all those years, we had not created enough close emotional relationships. And there was a void, there was an absence. There were a lot of things which, Marxism had not answered for me. And religion, the relationship of man to religion was one of those areas. Which
the relationship or the need for?
The relationship between man and religion. The need within human beings.
But you did accept that there was such a thing as religion.
Yes, that there
or
was.
God,
Yes.
And there had to be, therefore, a relationship.
There was a relationship. Whether one accepted it or whether one rejected it, it was right there. And I thought that we had been very dismissive of it all along. And that, we had been insensitive to people's faith and to people's belief. And this was a time when I felt...
But that's tactics. In terms of your own belief, you believe that there was this being somewhere?
Yes, I believe. As I told you, I never stopped believed in the being that was there. The being was always there. It was formal religion which one was, which one had moved away from. And which I continued to, be distant from. But when I came back, I wanted to look at the rituals. I wanted to find out what it was that gave people faith and why they needed to ritualize it. And I decided...
And did you?
I did. That's exactly what I was coming to, that for a period in my life, for a couple of years, I did practice. I did practice my faith in the sense that I would occasionally pray and that I would occasionally fast. That's the closest that I've ever gotten to being a formal practicing Muslim. And it did give me some kind, I think it was, I don't know, it was therapeutic. Simply that. It was therapeutic.
But then it could have been a therapist.
It could have been a therapist, except, and simultaneously one was doing a lot of reading into the psychology of religion, and that's the time when I read a lot of Jung and I read some Freud. And that was a period in my life when I felt closer to Jung than I did to Freud. And, this whole business of man and symbolisms and religious symbols and, answering needs and things that go back hundreds and thousands of years. All this, at this particular period in my life, I did a lot of reading, but I never bothered to go into religious books. I would read philosophy, or I would read psychology, or I would practice.
Since, you and I not only knew each other at that time, but very close, I recall, as many of us have had moments like this when we've had what might be called a breakdown, in the sense that something within us, not necessarily that you're tearing your hair and wandering on the street, but something that disintegrates within. And I remember that is a moment when you turned more to religion, and in fact so much so that I remember you're doing it in quiet, in secrecy, and not wanting Bunny to know. So, do you remember, I remember a moment when you said that don't tell Bunny about it, and then you
And I
told
don't
me
remember
years
that.
later.
But yes, in any case, I think the practice of religion is something which should not become a nuisance for others, or
But I was
take over
wondering,
other
from the
lives.
peer group, that we were, as a group,
Yes.
you didn't necessarily want.
No, except that one had a variety of friends, and I think that some of them would not have batted an eyelash, and perhaps would have felt quite happy that I'd gotten back to religion. But yes, that is the time. That's why I said that it was therapeutic. In a sense, it was calming. It was therapeutic. It it just helped me. It gave some form to my life. It gave a shape. It gave a discipline. Um, it made me subdue myself and some of that sort of the agitation. It made me quieter. It made me reflective. But I've never believed, and I don't think that I did at that time either. I never believed out of a desperation that, I'll go to hell, or there was a fear of the Lord, or that, my life had been such that I now needed to get back and make peace with God. It was never that. It was, there was a need to give a shape to my life, the need to give a meaning to my life, the need to place my life within some kind of a pattern, or to recognize and understand what the pattern of my life was. I thought that,
Or what life was about.
Or what
did you need to explain life to yourself?
I needed to explain life to myself.
I mean, why you were
That's
alive
true.
at all, or you existed?
No,
Is
I
that
don't
a
think
question
so.
that's ever bothered you?
Yes, it's a question that's bothered me a great deal. But I don't think I've ever turned to God to give me an understanding of that. I think it was more a question of self-discipline. It was more a question of recognizing that perhaps religion had a psychological purpose apart from anything else, of placing one within a context, of giving one a community, of making one aware of the need to discipline one's own self and one's own needs. And that it did. It helped me at that time. As you say, possibly a therapist could have done the same. But I had many friends who acted as therapists at that time. And there was no shortage of friends who would help one out, who would probe with one, who would spend endless hours dissecting. But they were never able to reach that, that core. I wanted quietness, I wanted calm, I didn't want agitation. And I thought that religion perhaps...
But isn't agitation dynamic and energizing?
Yes, but it's also destructive and disintegrating. And that is what was happening to me at that time. I mean, I really thought that, there was no quiet core to my being at all. There was nothing. I mean, I was incapable of reflection because I was so agitated. And I needed to calm myself down, and I must have turned to the only thing, again, the cultural whole business of being brought up within a tradition. You turn to what you know best. And Islam was not what I knew best, but the thing that I had grown up with, the most familiar. And so one turned to the most familiar in a sense, and I think it was very therapeutic for me those years. But that was also because it was not, there was, it never closed. It was not something which was going to shut my life off. It was something which was going to give me a breathing space, and I was going to find out a little more about myself. And I think it happened. It happened along with a lot of other things. So I don't know how central my faith was, but it happened in conjunction with a lot of help from friends, with close relationships, with a lot of love and caring around one, and a tremendous struggle within. And faith was just one of the components. But it certainly, I went to it for a purpose. And I think that it served that
at the
purpose.
level of spirituality, or did you go into the texts and all? You're talking about Islamic
No.
tradition?
No.
Did you
I
study
never
the
did that.
religion?
I never studied the religion at that point. Not at all. I didn't feel the need to get into the scholarly aspects of it at all.
Even the Quran?
I read the Quran, yes.
In English? Or
In English and in Urdu. In both.
During those years?
During those years. But I never finished the Quran.
But how did you respond to what is actually in the Quran?
Actually, I got impatient after a while. It just, I found that if I just went through the ritual or the exercise or in fact, what I found tremendously uplifting at that time was poetry, was spiritual poetry. So I did go into...
Although a lot of that is Sufi poetry.
And that, of course, was Sufi poetry. So it was that aspect of religion which had always appealed to me. But like the Sufis, who also went through a very rigorous, disciplined... I think that there's a misconception about the Sufis that they just lolled back and, had their glass of wine and thought about the universe. They didn't. They tortured themselves endlessly and went through the ritual and the discipline. And whereas, of course, I don't claim to have done any of that, but I did go through the discipline and I did go through some of the rituals. But at the same time, I was closer to the Sufi thinking, and spiritual poetry or Sufi poetry at that time was when I read it in translation, or I even bought books of Punjabi poetry and struggled with that, and read translations of Persian poets and others, and listened to a lot. Yes, this is in my 30s. Listened to a lot of music, which was the most liberating of all. Listening to Sufi poets being sung, I think, was extremely liberating. The Pathane Khan and the Abda Parveens come later. But
this is the 70s now.
This is the 70s. That's right.
By this time, have you moved away politically, or you sort of feel more comfortable within your class? I mean, culturally, there's more of an affinity given what you're thinking. And the activism has ceased, or whatever.
Yes, the activism has died down, definitely, in its original sense. But of course, one is still reading one's Mao and still, looking at one's Lenin and flipping through one's Engels and all of that. I mean, there were reference points, and then we were teaching it as well. But they were always reference points, and they continue to be reference points for me. I mean, that training or that thinking or that belief or the fact that they have provided me with the tools with which I analyze, that continues. Because the only thing is that I don't think that they were the tools, that were specific. You could expand, you could do much with it, which we weren't doing in those years.
Or are they, for you, not positing two different notions? I mean, historical materialism, which almost denies a spirituality or a need for something, or even recognizes perhaps a psyche. It talks about a consciousness that is a part of one's own history, as opposed to what you're saying was another side of you, which was not just recognizing a deity, which was larger than oneself or whatever, that one could even appeal to, but recognizing in that, I mean, that is implied that you recognize another dimension to human beings and them being material beings.
But I've never thought that Marx ever denied that, whether it was a false consciousness or not. The fact is that, there is more determinism in Marx than we like to think there is. Those of us.
More morality too.
And more morality too, which he likes to deny. And so I never felt, maybe these were areas that he didn't explore sufficiently, but these were not areas which I found necessarily antithetical to Marxism. Determinism of the kind, historical materialism, yes, that perhaps that conflict still persists, because I really don't know what creativity is all about. And I don't believe that man is, and this business of the dialectic, we look at it, it's too locked in our minds in a specific way. There's that constant interaction where you can't separate the two. And this is what I felt at that time, that, I was unable to, like earlier one was able to separate it and say, make the necessary arrows leading in different directions. Now it was, it was fluid. It was all churning inside me. And I didn't know what it was, except, as I say, that there was a belief. There was a belief in a maker, yes. There was a belief that the world didn't come about as a result of the Big Bang.
Or evolution.
Or evolution, evolution, I think that there was evolution. But, who created that first drop or that spermatozoa, whatever it was, one doesn't know.
We have a physicist who is going to discover that whatever his name is, the one that came to stay.
Oh yes, the one. Yes. What's his name? Whatever.
I think the Big Bang.
The Big Bang, yes. So all this was, as I say, churning inside me, and this was perhaps the most religious period of my life. And then I don't remember.
The good 2 years, then you're saying, was the most religious period, and then in 77 we get Zia-ul-Haq and Islamization, where there's a radical shift, with the state playing a very specific and very horrific role. Now you're at a point in your life where you are the closest you have ever been to Islam, and then you get the state justifying itself or using Islam in a particular way. How did you respond to it in those years?
Initially, of course, one felt that one should reject it all and just talk about secularism and not get involved in the debate. But
you don't believe in Islamic State?
I do not believe in an Islamic State at all. I do not believe in it. I have never believed in it, even in my most religious. I've always thought that there should be a secular state. But at that point, one, as the years went by and as martial law became a more permanent feature in our lives, I think we entered into this whole phase of either allowing somebody else to appropriate religion altogether, or looking at what was possible, using it as a weapon ourselves. And, not everybody thought of using it as a weapon. A lot of people believed or were close to belief and really felt that there was all possible scope for women within Islam, and that the Mullah Islam or the Mullah variant of Islam was the Islam that was being imposed upon us. And that was the time, I guess, when we decided that we would take matters into our own hand and see what was possible for us to do, how it was possible for us to interpret it to our own advantage. I must admit I was confused in my mind then, and I continue to be confused today about what we should have done. And
you're talking, of course, of the fact that Women's Action Forum, Lahore Women's Action Forum, and perhaps Islamabad more so, actually struggled and used within the struggle an argument that the interpretation of Islam or Islamization or whatever that was used by the state was incorrect. Not really refuting the fact that it should be an Islamic state, but that the interpretation was incorrect. The government, of course, was illegal. The military government, I think everyone is clear on. But there were individuals even among us in Lahore WAF. There was Karachi WAF, which at least some were taking a different position. And two things happened. One, within WAF, that the Karachi chapter was not able to mobilize to the extent that it did, that Lahore did. And to the extent, in fact, that even today very much the same women are involved in Karachi WAF in they were at that point, perhaps in Lahore too to some extent, but Lahore was able to mobilize many more women. That was a debate within WAF. It was a debate within the larger women's movement where other organizations, say Anjuman Khawateen and at that time Tehreek-e-Khawateen, who actually took issue with us on 2 points. One, of course, what they thought was us being apolitical when we were saying we were not political, non-political. The other was on this issue of strategic use of religion, using religion to fight religion. You're saying you're not sure now, then or now, how, whether or not one should have. But still you must have a feeling about it.
Yes, I do have a feeling about it, and that feeling was that those who were opposing the position that WAF was taking up were really quite marginalized themselves in terms of their contact with the people. In the sense that they had taken such a rigid stand on religion for so many years and had, in fact looked down upon most people who were religious or who showed, an association with the faith and had rejected them so completely that one was not sure what they were talking about, because they were not talking in the context of surviving within Pakistan. They thought, well, religion is a personal affair, it should be dismissed altogether, and they just wanted to go out in the streets and, shout a lot of slogans at that time, which was completely out. You needed room to maneuver at that point. And with quite genuine faith, one could say that the religion that was being used by the military rulers at that time was a particularly noxious and vicious brand of Islam. And there is enough of a spectrum within Islam for you to be able to pick up the more humanitarian aspects of Islam, or the more liberal aspects of Islam, or whatever it was. And that is initially where we started off.
But nevertheless, the moment you start reading the Quran,
yes,
forgetting even the hadiths and whatever, just the Quran itself, which is something, of course, we all did make us do. We all, I think all of us read much more about Islam in those years than we've ever done before or after. Some of the interviews, even the ones that I didn't expect, had really started reading it at that point. There were two things. One, there were the women who genuinely believed that there was space and there was a spirituality and the essence of Islam was liberating, and that if you interpreted it, and it was for that time and whatever, but if you interpreted it different, you could find women's liberation, or could be liberated or emancipated within the framework of Islam. That is quite different from strategic use, where you're using it because it is there in society and because you don't want to alienate, but actually you don't believe. And there is a hypocrisy and a dishonesty in that. How do you respond to that? My second question is that there is a lot in the Quran that women, more than, say, society generally, could probably find much more that is liberating in Islam and could use that aspect. But there is so much in the Quran itself that women meet their maker much earlier in the Quran. And beyond the point, it is very difficult to go, no matter how liberating you try and make it. How do you feel about that? A, is it hypocritical? And B, don't you find things really very uncomfortable in it?
Yes, I do, but in a sense it doesn't faze me as much as it does some people, because I don't think that I'm looking for a black and white answer. I have never found any ideology which has been completely liberating. I think it has taken the women's movement and the last 15-20 years of enormous struggle to liberate Marxism and to inject concern for women into Marxism. Similarly, I I am troubled
Well,
at
in
the
a way,
personal.
I mean,
Yes,
Engels
in a way.
started
In a
it,
way,
and then it
yes,
stopped.
that's right. But in a way, you could say the Prophet Muhammad started it 1400 years ago, and so why did we stop? And we did, and he did.
Yeah, but the Quran is the word of God, and Marx.
Well, I was just going to come to that. I think where perhaps I've had the advantage of my upbringing or the disadvantage of it is that religion has never been this business of the word of God, which is so inflexible. I've been frustrated by it as an activist, not as a believer. I've never been frustrated by this business. It's the word of God, or फिर इसकी ज़बर ज़ेर नहीं हम बिल्कुल हिला सकते, तो फिर now we're done for. That has never bothered me personally, because I've never been brought up to believe in it as ज़बर ज़ेर नहीं हिला सकते. But on the other hand, as an activist, I found it very frustrating, because I've, had the experience of talking to people who genuinely do believe that you cannot tamper with it because it is the word of God. And therefore, one has, in that sense, strategically said, but God has asked you to use your aql. And in fact, you are not disturbing the word of God. You are following God's injunction, which is, to use your mind and to reinterpret God's commandments in the light of whatever it is. The Quran is in our hands, and we will interpret it. In a sense, it was taking the Quran and taking the right of interpretation away from the clergy into their own hands. And it was a step forward.
But isn't it, isn't there a problem with the fact that, again, two questions, so connected ones. If women, if we as women, or anybody for that matter, is struggling against or fighting against the fact that X or Y individual, or the state in this case, or the mullah or whatever, is using parts of the Quran in their totality, and we, to fight them, also have a selective use. We are simply picking up other parts.
Absolutely.
So we cannot then take a stand, morally we cannot take a stand, that what the mullah is doing, or what Ziaul Haq did, or what the state may do, is incorrect because it's a selective use and not a totality and losing the essence, when we are also involved in a selective use. Is there no morality in that, or can we still take that stand?
I think we can take the stand that selective use was made, because the question is, are you moving towards liberation, or are you moving towards chaining people up? I think it was as simple as that in our minds. Now, in the ultimate analysis, of course, it is a clash between rival ways of looking at the world. And within each system, there is a validity. I'm sure within Ziaul Haq and whatever.
The state would say, the mullah would say exactly the same thing, that I'm using selective use because this ayat is more important than this one. And
Yes.
we are saying, no, this one is not important, this one is. But essentially, the mullah and the women's movement are doing the same thing.
Yes, they are.
So we cannot take a moral stand.
That somebody is being selective when
Yeah.
we ourselves.
And yes, we do say that.
We do say it because we have to say it. It's as simple as that. When you are fighting somebody, you've got to use the weapons that you have at your disposal. And so this was just one of the weapons that people used. That this is a selective use because it's retrogressive. And because we feel that our interpretation,
So we bring our own values in.
So we bring our own values into it. I don't think there's an ultimate morality to this at all.
But a connecting question, if we say it all to any woman, or in any book or whatever it may use, if we say that this part of the Quran now being the word of God, I mean, if we accept that, and we say this part of the Quran is something to use and this is liberating, whatever, the other part, we ignore, we don't even talk about it. We are in that ayah, by quoting that ayah, by using it in our struggle, what we are saying, I mean, the underlying assumption is still that this is the ultimate word. The ultimate, that this is something God has said. It is the last word on it. And being the last word, are we not reinforcing, by giving that sanctity, by giving that aura, by giving that ultimate say to the Quran, are we not reinforcing the whole issue of Islam and belief in it as an ultimate book? by word.
I don't think that we're doing that. I think that people themselves have a faith or don't have a faith. I don't think that we are preaching in either direction. I think we are respecting people's faith instead of, as I say, that one of the things that I found most disturbing about the left at one stage was sneering at people and their faith. And really, some people even went
No,
so far
that's
as to
something
do that.
else to what I'm really pushing, I mean, the point I'm pushing is that you do give reinforcement to religion if you say about any book that this is the ultimate book. Our interpretation is the one you should accept, or a more liberal interpretation, but actually one is saying in that God said, and therefore it is.
But one is saying to a believer
To a believer.
that
Now, if
God
you say
said,
God said on
your
page
God
9,
said, or God said on
now,
page
if we
9.
say God said on page 9, what he says on page 9 is fine, but what he says on page 29 is not fine. Are we not? I mean, how can we then say it?
I know exactly what you're saying, but my response to that is that I don't think one needs to go, one really needs to look at anyone else. I think, if I were to apply that question to myself, that's exactly the kind of faith that I have practiced. That I like what he said on page 9, but I don't agree with what he says on page 29. But that is the way I read books.
No,
All my life, I've read books that way.
No, that's
and,
other books you've read.
I've also
This is
enjoyed
the word
those
of
books.
God, and page 29 is as relevant as page 9.
All right, but as I say, for me, then it doesn't pose a problem at all because it is a book, and page 9 is wonderful. It sounds beautiful. It is a book for me. It is perhaps God's book. Maybe God makes mistakes. I don't know. As I say, the omnipotence of God is not something that I've particularly devoted my hours to. And I just like to wrestle with things, and therefore it does not annoy me if there is a contradiction in what I read. I say, aha, now here is a contradiction. However, by page 29, I get very involved with it until page 52. I'm enjoying it, and then suddenly something comes and I say, well, there must have been trouble here. Or I give it a historical reading, perhaps, more, a more historical perspective to it. Now, the crisis is for the believer who likes to think that the Quran is an ahistorical document, which it is not. Not for me, it is not. What does one say to such a person? Except, as a woman activist, if I have a believer in front of me, what do I say to that woman? Do I say your belief is wrong? Do I try and argue her out of her faith? Should I be doing that? Or should I be saying, what God says on page 9 is great. Why don't we just forget about page 29 and focus on page 9? That's exactly what we did. That is exactly what we did, and that is the only thing that it was possible to do. I really don't know.
I'm talking about the morality of it.
You're talking about the morality of it, but I don't think that it is so immoral, because why is it immoral? Why is it immoral?
It's selective.
It's selective.
And it's using.
Yes, it's using for a purpose. And I would use it.
The means justifies the end?
The means in this case certainly justifies the end. Because I don't understand the Quran. I'm not going to spend, as an activist, I do not have the kind of leisure whereby I reflect on the Quran endlessly, when I have an early morning, whatever, to go and do. So I can't do it. I have to strengthen people's belief that, the book that they believe in is giving them some recognition as equal human beings. Some recognition for them to take that first step.
So religion can be used as a liberating force. Is it a subversive activity?
I think that it can be used for subversive purposes. That's probably all very immoral talk, and I don't think that you should use any of this for anything. But yes, I certainly think I tell myself that I have a clear conscience when I use it, because I genuinely do read the Quran like a book, and I do wrestle with it, and I struggle with it, and I don't expect it to be smooth and without contradictions from page 1 to page 129. 24. And one would love to get into the Makkah ki ayat and the Medina ki ayat and what were the differences and what were the historical circumstances in which certain ayats were revealed, and therefore get into a much deeper understanding of the Quran and the psyche behind the Quran. But obviously it is not something that you can do when you are out telling women that there are certain rights within the book which they can ask for, which was all that one was saying. And one had to be selective at that time. I mean, you know.
But now you still feel that they need to be selective.
Now for what?
Well, at that time we're talking, you keep saying at that time. At that time meaning the state was coming down. The state is of course still coming down.
But it's not so harsh.
Yeah. So would
Religion
one still, or would you change your tactics now?
I would change my tactics if necessary.
But why? The people have not changed. The women still
because the
believe.
people were more afraid then. And
So
if
it wasn't
women
their
still...
belief, it was the state that
It
was
was the
bothering.
state that was, but alright, let's look at a community of believers. If I go into a community of believers, I'm not going to go there to challenge their faith. I'm going to ask them to understand their faith and to do their interpreting for themselves. That is the only thing that I think you can ask them to do. The rest of it, I really don't know. Once they have done that, once they have taken that initial step themselves, then they can go anywhere.
One last sort of serious, not last, but the serious questions. A lot of what you're saying, especially when you were talking about your earlier life and whatever, do you make a distinction between the culture of being a Muslim and the fact of being Islamic? Are they two different things for you?
Islamic, you mean a believing Muslim? Or what?
A believing Muslim as opposed to a Muslimhood.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I believe in pan-Islamism, if that is what you mean by Muslimhood.
No, is there something like a cultural Muslim?
Yes, I think that if I were to call myself anything at all, it would be culturally I'm a Muslim. That's what I identify
Culturally, aren't
with.
you a Hindu living in the subcontinent of
Maybe
India?
if I'd lived on in an undivided India,
given
I
the
might
history
have,
of,
I
all
might have
this
felt closer
Islam,
to.
all religions, whenever they go somewhere, and Islam and Christianity have traveled all over the place. Islam particularly traveled to areas that had very long traditions and religions and cultures and whatever, based, as religion was based, within a social context. In a lot of ways you come out because of social relations of production. I mean, why do you have Basant? Basant is the first day of spring. Why do you have a whole range of things that have now have religious connotations, but actually were based on the processes of production. A lot in Islam itself, the fact that it was within a trading community and a city-state and whatever, the whole notion of property came about because it actually did exist. It doesn't talk much about agriculture because it wasn't there. I mean, it talks only to the extent that it knew. Similarly, we who are born and live and have imbibed, I'm sure, and our Islam is certainly tempered by the many thousands of years of other traditions and other world views and other cosmologies. Where do you feel culturally in all of this? Do you still think that this is Islam?
Yes, it's Islam. It's Islam as it exists in the subcontinent, in the Indo-Pakistan subcontinent today. This is Islam. However, it has been tempered and it has coexisted and it has changed and it has been changed and it has absorbed and it has influenced and been influenced and all the rest of it. That is my Islam. It's a very subcontinental Islam. I'm sure I'd feel very uncomfortable with an Indonesian. But however, there is a substratum of belief which would be common. But then, of course, you must understand that along with the Hindu and the Buddhist and the earlier belief systems which Islam came into contact with. There is the entire Central Asian and the Persian, and I think to a lesser extent the Arabic influence on Islam as well, which makes one appreciate other cultures and feel close to other literatures and whatever it is. It's all one big amalgam, and I would call it Islam.
But would you feel closer to Islam as a pan-Islamic thing, or would you feel closer to the subcontinent of India, culturally?
I think I'm wildly excited about what Turkey is about, or even wanting to go to Isfahan, as much as wanting to go to Ajmer or Banaras or any of these places. It seems to pull in both directions. The only one that I seem to have a personal prejudice against is Saudi Arabia. But apart from that, I genuinely, I happily see the mix. And because we are existing in Pakistan today, one is pulling in that direction.
But that's also the geographic situation.
And that's the geographic and the historical situation.
Who we are.
Exactly. Personally, I'm fascinated by Hinduism. Personally, I find that I would love to go and explore it a little more. And there seems to be a lot of more life and color and vivacity in it than there is in our religion at times, certainly. But I would still define myself within the Islamic tradition, within the Muslim tradition.
There's one of the intriguing things, or one of the things that people say, well, I will set aside the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, is the monotheism in it, the single God theory. Yet there are others who have talked about this in the context of actually, and there was an interesting discussion the other day, that Islam is in fact not monotheistic, that the 99 names or whatever are articulations and manifestations of God, and there are actually several dimensions in this one unit, which is very similar to the Hindu or the Greek pantheon. They have only physically come out in different forms, but the idea is pretty much the same. Have you ever thought of it in that context?
And I would tend to agree. Because the monotheism of Islam, I think in any case, subcontinental Islam has been very strongly influenced by the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition as well. And of course the Buddhist tradition was influenced in turn by earlier. So the monotheism of Islam is it's again the same business of that eventually there is a unity. The manifestations can be myriad.
Even the pantheon of the Hindu pantheon has actually one source of power.
It has one source of power, exactly,
which
comes out in different names. And as you say, whether it is the 99 attributes of God, or whether it is the countless names of the Prophet himself. He didn't have one name; he had countless names. There is a magic in numbers. 1,24,000 या 1,40,000 पैगंबर. And then this business of... So there is... The variety within Islam is there. I've never seen it in monotheistic in that awful sense that, it is so rigid that it has, it lacks creativity or it lacks expression. There is one single expression. I think that there's a variety of expression.
But God in the monotheistic religions is... God is pure, wonderful, whatever, although he can be punishing and all that.
He's both.
And then evil is
He's quite dualistic.
Yeah, but there is another thing that is a power, and that is the evil. The shaitan, the Satan, the Lucifer fallen, the challenge, the other. In, say, Hinduism, that is integrated within. Good and evil exists in all. Man, woman, whatever, also in the gods. In the monotheistic religions, they have been separated. And yet, God has all these variations. The pure God also has all these variations. Do you believe in this evil, the separate evil? the shaitan, who is warring with God to control the world and human beings?
I don't know, I think it's
Is
a myth,
it
but it's a,
philosophically something that excites you?
can't say that I've thought about it recently, Bunny. It certainly used to excite me, but it's very dualistic, as you say. It's very clearly darkness and evil. But then again, as you say, that there is the Rahman and the Rahim and the Qahar and the Jabbar,
Yeah.
which are both, that there is that opposition within God
I
Himself.
find that both of it, all of these are in the God of the Quran and the God of
It is in the God of the
Quran. And then
Quran.
why do we need a shaitan?
Then there is the split. Then there is the rebel, actually. It is the rebellion in Lucifer or Satan which is being punished or which is being wrestled with.
You're doing a very good job.
And
I
think that I think that God has a healthy respect for Satan, because He's certainly allowing him to get away with a great deal in this world. I think that I do believe in a dualist in that sense.
That there is evil is
That
separate
there is
from
that
good.
evil is separate from good.
Warring with each other
Warring
for
with
the
each
souls
other.
of human beings.
Yes. I mean, if you were to just ask me offhand, I haven't thought about
But
it.
then why would one want God, the pure God, to also have the evil?
Well,
Not the evil,
He doesn't
but
have the evil,
not the
He
evil.
has the attributes of power. Because He has to battle
And revenge.
as well. And revenge.
Whatever.
Which, as you know, in the Judeo-Christian, the Judeo-Islamic certainly tradition is very essential, because God is God of power. And Satan has broken away a piece of that power and taken it, and there's this battle going on, and I believe in it.
Ultimately, and this is really the last question, all religions, and in fact, even philosophy, I would extend this to, and even Marxism, have within them an ultimate morality, which is really be good, be nice, be gentle, be whatever. Essentially they're saying the same. Those who believe in a spirituality and a larger presence or a higher morality and whatever, all religions really do. Religions believe in that. Marxism believes that man can become that, but it's still there. Are all these deities one, or do you think that Allah is different from Bhagavan and different from Jesus and different from
I don't think He's different.
Judah, and this ultimate source is the same and religions are merely interpretations?
I think religions are merely interpretations.
The deity is one.
I think the deity is
So Allah is not superior.
No. And in fact,
So why
there
does
are
God
some.
have to
I think that
repeat
there are some verses in the Quran which say that no one religion is superior to another. Another one of those wonderful contradictions that, of course, you
But
will
it
go
also
straight to
talks
hell
about-
if you don't believe.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it also says that Islam enjoins upon you faith in every religion which has gone prior to it.
Of the book.
No. Of every religion which has gone prior to it. Not just of the book.
But it is the last religion.
But it is the last. It is the seal. This I don't know really. I haven't checked it out in the Quran, but apparently
I mean,
it does.
this is what Allah is.
That's right.
It is the last
It is the last.
word.
But Islam means submission to all, not only to the will of God, but to all that has gone before. And all that has gone before is human history. So as far as I'm concerned, that's Brahma, and that's Krishna, and that's Buddha, and that's everybody.